Hello and welcome back to the third and second to last video in this Limbo Miniatures Nun painting series. I rewatched some of the footage from yesterday, which was the second video, and I observed that I have a tendency to say a lot. So I'm going to try and eliminate that in this video. I do tend to do it a lot when I'm using my explaining voice, so I'll attempt to curb that. So what I'm doing here, and what you'll see in this final video on painting the actual model, the fourth video focuses on painting the base, is completely changing the tone and warmth of the non-metallic metal, and really refine and texture a variety of other surfaces. So this is, for me, the most fun part of painting. In many ways, I rush through base coats and other layers just so I can get to this part, which is where you can add interesting glazes, colors, textures, and really start thinking about how the model's various volumes interact. So this is the highlight that I'll be using a glaze over. It is very high value, higher value than it will end up being. And I don't know that I've actually explained why this works or why I do this particular process. It has to do with how light and paint work. The best example of this is if you undercoat a model in white and then undercoat a model in black and then use an airbrush or even just a brush to paint a layer of the same color on both of those models, you'll get a very different looking color, even though you've used the same color. And the reason for that is, even though you've used the same color, acrylic paint, especially through an airbrush, but also with a brush, is generally partly transparent. And so what you're actually getting is light coming through the paint, hitting that white or high value color from underneath and rebounding with a stronger, more vibrant color. So this is a piece of information that you can use to your advantage by, if you want bright, vibrant, intense, saturated colors, they should generally go over a white undercoat, or as I've demonstrated here, over a white high layer. If you want more muted, desaturated, duller, darker colors, go over a black. There's exceptions to both of those rules, and the way that I describe that might make it seem like going over a black is worse. That's not the case. It's just different. And probably the key part of, I guess, learning and experiencing painting and enjoying this process is finding out when the right time to use the knowledge and techniques that you've actually learnt, when the right time to use those is. So when you want to use a black undercoat to provide a desaturated color, or when you want to use a white undercoat to really pump up the contrast. And if you look at a zenithal prime, this is a more advanced way of utilizing this concept that probably I don't take to its fullest extent because I don't work with as much transparency as some others, but it is relatively easy to see the difference. So what I've been doing here is mixing two colours. It's a Vallejo light orange and a scale fantasy colour called Kokum Copper. And I've mixed these together and added some of the trusty Jo Sonia to create a glaze. It is not completely dilute, no-bodied glaze. There's a bit of substance still to the colour, and you can tell that because when I paste the brush on the model, you're not seeing the paint run all over the place, even though I've got quite a significant amount of paint on there. So it's thicker than a traditional glaze, but not as thick as a base layer sort of consistency. And so I'm being more measured in the way that I apply this glaze over the top of the previously painted white lights. I'm not hitting the dark areas as much. I am still catching some of them, but I'm staying away from the deep shadows. So this is, my cat's just bounced up to say hello. Do you want to say hello on this recording, Peach? Meow. No, not today. So this is the first of a couple of uses of this process, and the advantage of using this technique is that because the layers are so dilute, you're not creating a lot of thickness. You can do multiple thin coats and filter the color until you achieve a different tone than what you initially started with. So you'll see running this at normal speed at the moment, just so you can see exactly how precise I'm being with where these glazes go. It's a similar brush consistency, to a wash, but I'm not treating it in the same way as a wash. And one of the things I've talked about in my class, I have taught a few little classes where I just go on, some basic rudimentary techniques and, paint consistencies and that sort of thing. One of the golden rules of any painting, and most importantly any dilution, is understanding that you can use any dilution you want of paint, any dilution. It can be completely thick, or it can be basically 30 parts water to 1 part paint. The way that you control that, though, is by unloading the brush. So when you move from your palette to the model, you should always unload the brush on some paper towel or similar before moving to the model. So that's how you get control of the paint using a glaze. Even if you wipe a lot of paint off your brush and it feels like you've got very little left, generally speaking, there is still some residue in the bristles in the well, and most people that have painted for a while will be able to attest to that, because your paintbrushes tend to degrade over time, and it's not because the bristles themselves degrade, it's because of that small amount of residue that dries inside the brush. So by unloading the brush on a paper towel, by removing that excess paint, you immediately regain control over where the paint goes, even if it's very, very dilute. And I'll talk about this brush in a second and what I'm doing. Even if it's very dilute, it will only come out of the brush very, very small amounts, and so you get to control the use of that color. So this is something I do on occasion, and in some of my earlier works I did this quite a lot as I was experimenting. That's a very large white synthetic brush with flat bristles, and I found that when using that brush with almost dry paint, not completely dry, but almost, that the bristles themselves would provide a lot of texture. So I don't use it much, these recent pieces, I haven't used it a lot, but I was searching for something on these pants. I wasn't feeling the way that I'd painted them. I wasn't feeling the texture and the light, and so I tried to work with some textures, and as you can see here, you use the large brush to create something with texture and shape underneath before coming in and refining some of those ideas with the finer brush. So these colors are German camo grey, or German grey, sorry, and I've mixed in a little bit of orchid light, but mostly ice yellow, and I'm just using diagonal cross-hatching strokes to create some sort of, whether it's what's that word for things that, stockings, whether it's a stocking style texture, there you go, going well tonight, or just some sort of fabricy, leathery texture. I wanted something different. Now you can see this is quite strong, and in many ways probably overpowering, and that's okay because I am going to go back and use the airbrush to smooth that out. So just an easy way to create some texture in the airbrush will help to smooth some of that out. Here I'm actually using some contrast paint, which is the orange one, I can't remember the name, to just re-add a little bit of saturation, a little bit more intensity to this color. It's very easy to lose the power of a color when you highlight, when you add white or ivory. So I find sometimes using the contrast paints in this very controlled, filtered way will help you really re-add some power back into the color. Just doing the straps on a leg, very, very simple. I'm not looking for a lot of volume or texture here. I just want to add a little bit of a desaturated element to further reinforce the color in the skin. So this is mostly grey mixed in with the charred brown base. And you can see I then add a tiny bit of ice yellow to really explain where the light is. There is still some visible brush strokes there. I think with any strap, any leather element, you do want to see some texture of some description. But as with many things I do, I am going to bring this down a little bit with some glazes of inks or colors, just to again drop it back down in value so that the skin really pops out. This was sped up to times 2 a little while ago, so just in case you missed that, I did speed it up. My hands are quick, but they're not that quick. So one thing that I've found really important, especially for non-metallic metals, is this black line as well as the sparkle highlight. So the black line helps to break down the surfaces and make it look more like metal as you're going through the whole sequence of contrasts from the value scale from darkest to light. So just really separating each volume can help to reinforce the object. It's not always necessary, and in some cases you don't want to do it, especially if you're trying to reinforce that it is one object. But it does help to further sell the illusion of metal. So in total, the entire paint job on this model concluded in about 4 hours, so a little bit longer than the previous Scar paint job, with the obvious reasons that it's a significantly more detailed model with a base and some other aspects. But again, you can still see how the sketching and refining approach just frees up your time towards firstly creating the concept that you're trying for, and then helping that become a reality. If you were to go with the old school method of many thin layers to build up extremely smooth transitions, you lose two things. You lose this extremely high and powerful contrast, and you also lose the holistic view of the piece as you're painting it. I used to spend many hours on a small section of head or face, whatever, when I was painting many years ago for the old Golden Demon competitions. Just FYI, I won a bronze back in the day. Pretty cool. Long time ago. Also, the Australian Golden Demon competition was nothing compared to the overseas competitions. When I say nothing, I mean in terms of number of entrants. We had very few entries compared to the European competitions. When I say nothing, we still had Sebastian Archer head overseas and win a Slayer Sword overseas, if I remember rightly. So we definitely had some incredibly high quality pieces. So this is bringing the colour back again, and so I felt I really wanted to bring some warmth to this colour and almost make it a goldy bronzy sort of colour. So I went in and did this same process, the lights a little bit more particular than before with the ice yellow, and then I'm now doing a glaze with a much more intense orange, and that's a mixture of light orange, and I've actually used a small amount of fluoro yellow mixed in with that. So I've used, just so you know there, I'm taking the model out to view it under normal lighting. On occasion I do that just to get a sense of what it looks like under normal lights and not studio / proper lighting. The Flora Colors, they're really interesting. I have probably overused them over the last 12 months, really enjoying just how powerful the colour is. We talk about saturation. They are saturation plus. They are just the absolute strongest, most intense version of a colour that you can get. And you have to be very considered and careful in how you use them, or they can overpower the model. And probably that's been my experience with them, is I've overused them and they've overpowered a model. But there is nothing that will add vibrancy and saturation to colour than a little bit of fluoro mixed in with it. So fluoro yellow and fluoro magenta tend to be the two that I use predominantly. The yellow you can add to orange, you can also add to green, and it works on both of those. The magenta, obviously adding it to a red, can create some nice interesting pinks as well as purples. I haven't found a fluoro blue that I enjoy much yet, but there is also a fluorescent red from Vallejo Game Air that I also like. So this layer, again, that glazing technique, we're at normal speed here, just showcasing this, which is, it's a critical, a part of my approach. I think it's important to see just how controlled it is, even though it's a dilute paint. But it has the effect of not just bringing the lights down, it also brings the shadows up closer to this same tone. So you'll see I do go back in and refine the shadows with some dark shadows, because it's really vital that you have that separation and you have that contrast. So using the glaze over the top of a midtone will help smooth the transition between the light and the dark, but it also, if you hit too much of the dark area, will change the value. So if you were to take a little freeze frame of this particular shot here with the bronze and go back and compare it to the silver, I think you would immediately see why I made the decision to change. It just changed the whole feeling of the model, the whole atmosphere, even though the rest of the piece has black and white, which are not really colors that have a temperature. Because of this addition of the gold, it's almost like we now have a temperature in those blacks and whites. So it's an interesting change. This is, I have no idea. I might be airbrushing, I can't remember. What are we doing, Deno? Nope. Oh, here we go. Yeah, just using another glaze. Fantastic. Come up with some new techniques, you idiot. This might be a contrast paint. I don't think it's a contrast paint, actually. I think I used Ink Tense Chestnut there. Just looking at the way that's coming off the brush. Strong colour. Outstanding. So the final parts that this model has left, I'm using the hairdryer there to dry that off. Great tool, hairdryer, go buy one, $15, magic. We have a little bit more work on the white. The main part that we have left to focus on is the black, and then the final airbrushing stages. So, this is just the, I guess, pop highlights on the bronze. Very, very specific placement here. As always, respecting where I want the light source to be. Always, non-metallic metal needs to have this feeling, otherwise it doesn't quite read correctly. As always, this is just my perspective, my approach. There are, I'm sure, other painters who paint non-metallic metal probably far better than I do that have a different approach. The key part is you should enjoy what you're doing and think about the way that you want to paint and do whatever that is that you enjoy. That was an email coming in on my work phone. So I'm not speaking much, as this is something of a repetition of previous processes, but that's a great shot there. Fantastic camera work. Just absolutely on point. I think I'm doing the white hood, probably. There you go. Good stuff. Oh, we're going back in with more glazes. Jeepers. I should get a new technique. This is just overdone. Now, look, I think this is a really great example of the versatility of this technique. You can continue to make changes and revisions and up contrast, reduce contrast very, very quickly and easily. This is obviously a very, very much stronger mix of the fluoro yellow. It is actually Vallejo Model Air, I believe. And that's representing the lights. So on a silver or a steel or a color of that nature, I would use an ivory color for the lights. Because I decided that this was somewhere between gold and bronze, the light that I've chosen is a bright gold / yellow one. And so this is helping to reinforce that atmospheric sense. I really like the shape of that extremely impractical weapon because I feel it is a good example of how you can consider non-metallic metal, how you can consider metallic surfaces. There's a very distinct light direction on the piece. And so when you look at where the light has been placed on that object, you can see that it's hitting the edges where that light direction has come from, but you can also see that the underneath areas aren't receiving the same highlights. That's ultimately how you get it looking correct, is by considering the actual source of light and using reference materials to establish how that surface would react. That's the chestnut ink glaze that I was talking about before. Ink intensity set from scale 75. Prior to the contrast paints coming out was one of my go-tos for continuing to add saturation and nuance to various colours. I still use them a lot. The chestnut and the wood are two of my favourite colours, but I do also like the Ink Tense Violet, and they recently released a second series of paints, Ink Intensity paints, and I quite like the olive and crimson from the second set. Fun facts with Trent. So I do have intent to set up a camera for the palettes. Does add additional work in terms of cutting together the videos, so I'm not sure how I'm going to use it as yet. May just be there when I mix specific colours, but we shall see. Alright, Dan, I wrap it up here, mate. This is just repetition plus. Probably a good note, I guess, is that miniature painting in many ways is an exercise in tedium. There's a lot of repetition of the same task over and over again. Some people enjoy that, some people do not. I don't know that I fall into the camp of someone that enjoys it, but I do have the ability to do it. Probably the way that I paint is something that reduces that repetition. Here we go. So some airbrushing, cool stuff. So I'm just, again, thinking about the holistic piece and thinking about the colours. That whole lower area there, I wanted to add a little bit more purple. And so this is actually contrast paint through the airbrush. It's a shyish purple, and I'm using it actually all over the metal, the boots, things, and some of the lower skin tones on the hands, for example, if a little bit of overspray is catching on those lower legs, so I'm also getting some of that, and it's just to add that harmonization of the piece. It's not the last time I use the airbrush on this model, but it is a good example of just how, if you look at those highlights now on those legs, you can see that they're not at all the same scratchy feel. There's much more consistency in those strokes. So you've still got the texture, you've still got that layer of texture there that was underlaid, but it's a bit more refined. I'm sure many professional painters would probably do things differently and in a more precise way that saves time. They'd probably make less mistakes. But that's okay. I'm happy with making mistakes and enjoying learning how to correct them. I don't know what I'm doing here. I think I might be doing a varnish on the whole model just to harmonize all of the various reflective surfaces. Particularly the contrast paints have a reflective surface, as does the... Nope, I think I added a touch of black into the shyish purple, actually, is what I did. Probably. Yeah, that's what I did. Added a little bit of black. Wanted to make the black more black and use the value scale to continue to draw the focus upwards. So by even just tinting the lower half of the model with more black, it makes the upper areas of the model, the neck, the shoulders, the face, that whole area look more vibrant and brighter. There's quite a few resources I point people to. The first, obviously I've talked about Patreons, some great Patreons out there, but what actually really changed the way that I thought about painting display pieces was a book called Figurepedia by JBT, Jeremy Bonament Taboul. And it's a quite old book now, from a long, long time ago. I would say 10, 15 years maybe. But it's called Figurepedia, Light and Colour. And it breaks down those two elements. And I think at this point, while we're looking at some footage of the same thing for the last, what feels like 20 minutes, I think the thing to recognise and realise that'll help in many ways, that's a matte varnish in case you're wondering, is the two things, light and colour, are separate and interact together and are fused together, but you actually have to consider them separately. And one really fantastic trick for doing this and assessing the two things separately is taking a photo of your piece and then doing a bit of photographic manipulation in your phone and turning it to a grayscale version. it's a really, really powerful tool, because what you get to see is just how light interacts on the model without the color influencing your eyes. So red is a fantastic example of this. Red's a very powerful color. It's warm, it draws your gaze, and many painters will actually use red as a way to draw focus towards the face or towards key areas, because it's such a punchy color that draws your eye. But often when you punch a model into grayscale, you will see that red usually is quite a dark value, and so it can be a bit deceptive in terms of whether you have enough contrast on your red, or whether you just think you have enough contrast because the red itself is quite a powerful color. And this grayscale photo is an easy way to remove color from your perception and determine the values of the piece just from a light perspective. So this conversation started from that JBT book, Light and Color. Really fantastic book. It talks about breaking down volumes into shapes. It shows clear examples of that. Shows how various surfaces interact with light. Extremely elucidating piece of literature. The wording on some things is sometimes challenging, as Jeremy's not a native English speaker, although his English is certainly far better than my French. But well worth tracking that particular book down if you're genuinely serious about display painting. It pretty much revolutionised the way I think about miniature painting. But I've had a number of things that did that, classes and other experiences with other painters, travelling to painting shows, Patreons, etc. So I'm doing the black. The black, as I talked about during the scar video, is one of the hardest colours, in my experience, to paint and have it read as black. And it's especially hard to have it feel like it's a part of the atmosphere of the piece, because a lot of people's default response is highlight black with grey. I'm actually using Orchid Light here. I'm mixing in a light purple with the black instead of a grey. That is the same colour that I initially tried to use on the metallic armour sections. And there's a little bit of that in some of the leather, particularly on the legs. So by using this colour instead of a grey, it just works a little bit more in the context of the atmosphere of the model. So my experience with black, it's tough to make it read as black. The approach I generally take is highlight higher than I need, and then use glazes of black to darken it. The way I approach it in this is pretty similar, but I do a little bit more back and forth in working between the layers, the transitions, just as I feel like there's actually a significant amount of black on this model. I just want to make sure it feels consistent. When I was first doing display pieces, I actually used just straight black paint and then a slightly satin varnish. And people are always asking me, oh wow, how do you do your black? It looks so good. I'd be like, trade secrets, mate. Can't tell you. Literally painted black, varnished, job done. It's because it looked black. It's because it looked like it was black. But because the light was just reflecting off that slightly satin finish, it looked like black. with some highlighting. So maybe I should go back to doing that actually. That was a big time saver. Big time saver. Yeah, I don't think I'll go back to that. Cool, so you can see this black process is, again, relatively quick. I'm using this sketching and then some glazes here to just smooth out the transitions. Getting the consistency of those glazes right and getting the color of those glazes right is probably the part of the process. I actually add a little bit of blue in here. It's a Vallejo model air color called Signal Blue. I really like Signal Blue. It's a very dark, but also it's got a little bit of saturation to it. And sometimes black actually looks more like black when you put blue in the shadows. I can't give you a reason for why. Sometimes it just works. So the interesting part about those little shapes there, that's a lot of light there for what is supposed to be a black area. And at this point in time, it probably doesn't look at all correct, but you have to remember the way that the light would interact on those particular fantastic objects. The light's coming from the top, so the top part of those is going to be significantly higher value than the bottom. But you can't have a significantly higher value on black if your shadow is pure black, unless you really add some light. So it's taking it up higher than it should be to a grey, and we will bring it back down with some glazes. Here I am black lining, and I talked about this earlier, and I think it's a really good example of looking at this this metal, and check out, particularly on this particular object here, just what it does for the actual feeling of what sort of surface it is. So there's one final video left in this series, and it's the first one that I've filmed painting a base. It's quite fun doing the base for this model. I actually filmed it before I filmed this one, believe it or not. So there you go. But thanks to the magic of editing and film, you're going to see it afterwards. But this is actually pretty much towards the end of painting this model. The end of this video is almost the last pieces of painting I do on the model. There is a few little areas that I do. I add a small freehand symbol, which I did not include on this film, so not appearing in this film. And I fix up the staff end and a few other things. There I'm just doing a little bit of glazing of some pink and purple mixed in together. Just wanted to play around with some of the colours in the gold. Don't necessarily want it all to be the same, feel the same. So just a little touches, little nuances. And again, that's something I said before. This is why this is fun. You can just tweak things and add little bits and pieces at this stage. So very good fun. Orchid light and small touch of ivory, I think, mixed into the German grey. So as this video draws to a close, if you have any suggestions for things you would like to see, you can send them to me or not. Don't really mind. This is a further reinforcing of the underlaying texture here, and I think this, you can see how thin the brush strokes are and how dilute the paint is, but it's really nice addition, I think, to the feeling of those pants. It's how I would approach doing fishnet stockings on a Harley Quinn model if I was ever to go around painting a Harley Quinn model. Very dilute paint, very thin brush strokes. But geez, it would be easy to get it wrong because I've got that backing there of some other stuff. Oh, here we go. So I'm going to use the airbrush to do the glazing on the black because it just helps. It helps reinforce the smoothness, really allows you to add black. You can see I'm getting right in close there and going right up to those shoulders, underneath the breasts. Everywhere's getting the black. It is pretty much straight black. I think I used the contrast paint actually. Black Templar's black or something. Because it's slightly transparent, so I didn't want to completely kill all the work that I'd done, but looks like I may have added a touch of signal blue in there too, as per my previous statement. There's something about signal blue or dark blue that helps you read something as black better. It's just such a fun tool to use, the airbrush. It really is. It's easy once you've experienced and experimented with it. Just, you'll notice the model's on the base now, so don't tell anyone I filmed it before this. Just really easy to create little subtle shadows and shades, and fun to use. Fun to experiment with, fun to see what you can do. It's great seeing some airbrush work of artists who use the airbrush to do artwork on bikes and cars, and you look at it and you think, wow, how does someone do that with an airbrush? And it also makes me think, well, how can I do stuff like that on my models? So it's an exciting tool, and I think it's probably one of the coolest things to happen to the world of miniature painting in a long time, is just the proliferation of airbrush in the market. I think when I first started painting, nobody used an airbrush for miniature painting. It was just not even a thing. And I remember probably wasn't until 2006 or 7 that started to see a few airbrushes out in the market and people talking about airbrushing, and even then, I don't think it's something that was seen much until it was popularised by a few painters, and now it seems to be a staple tool in many painters' arsenals, which is great. I hope we continue to see revolutionary equipment such as that, making the miniature hobby exciting for many years to come. So, matte varnish, AK Interactive, going in here and sealing all of the airbrushing, all of the previous layers of work done. Again, it really has a noticeable effect in taking away the different reflective nature of different colours, particularly contrast paints. They're a good example of something that's very shiny, and just bringing everything back to the same register gives you a much better sense of the model. And I think if you compared the shot of that model prior to the matte varnish to post the matte varnish, you would observe a pretty distinct difference. So that's it. I do have a finished shot of the finished model in the next video, the end of the basing video. Will be a finished shot. I don't do much additional work to the painting after this. There's a few little tweaks, minor things that I add, but that's pretty much the extent of painting this model. So as I use the hairdryer to dry it off, really easy to see how those techniques, great example of the skin tone that I was talking about in the very first video compared to how it appeared in the first video to how it appears now. Feels like a completely different color. It's not, it's the same. So great lesson there. Cool, so that's the extent of this third video. Appreciate all of the views. Little inside joke there for Oz Machine listeners. So thank you very much. Big Dino out.